2021 work session of the Portland City Council. Colleagues, the Division of Community Safety, which is housed within the Office of Management and Finance, plans to present its research and recommendations to advance solutions to increase community safety for all Portlanders. The division proposes 4 action areas that you're going to hear more about today: reducing calls for service, sending the right responders to the right call, assessing alternative emergency service providers, as well as governance. And with that, I will turn it over to the director, Mike Myers. Good afternoon. Or Tom, are you starting us off today?
I'm going to start, Mayor. Thank you.
Very good. Tom Reinhardt, Chief Administrative Officer, kicking us off. Good afternoon, Tom.
Thanks, Mayor. Good afternoon to you and to all City Council members. For the record, my name is Tom Reinhardt. I'm proud to be the city's Chief Administrative Officer. I will be facilitating the work session today. And after your Tuesday work session, I know the bar is pretty high to have a good one. So I think we have a good plan, and we're excited to be with you. As this council knows, we always like to go over the goals for the day and to let you know what we plan to do. Next slide, please. Director Myers and I scheduled this work session to discuss the work plan for the Community Safety Division that we are just starting up and lifting off. As you will recall, during the last time we were together to do a work session on this topic in February, we did not yet have a community safety transition director, and much of the work was still conceptual. I'm very excited, as I hope you are, about Mike's leadership to date, the engagement of leaders in our community safety bureaus with him, and the progress the team has already made to coordinate our efforts and improve service. This is what we're going to try to do today with you. We're going to present the plan. We're going to receive feedback, as you can see, from a community panel, and of course you as our council. And I want to explain why 3 is on there, where we know that we have increasing challenges on multiple issues in the city. We want to ensure that we're following up with you well, and not only meeting your expectations for the work plan, but also how you are receiving updates and information as we go forward. Next slide, please. So this is the planned agenda to accomplish those goals. I'm not going to read through it. I'm just going to give you a chance to go through it and get a sense of where we're going and get grounded in the agenda today. As you can see, we're grateful to have Dr. Jonathan Jay from Boston University with us again. And we have our directors of our 4 bureaus involved in this work, as well as Director Green from the Office of Violence Prevention. So thank you to Director Causey, Chief Boone, and leadership from all the bureaus that are participating. We will reserve 25 minutes at the end for question and answer. Please keep your pencils and pens moving and keep the chat active, both council members and staff. We want to make sure that we're capturing everything for the Q&A, and I will do a short review at the end and clarification on next steps. Next slide, please. 2 years ago, working with Mayor Wheeler and Commissioner Hardesty, I organized the Public Safety Working Group with a charter that was signed by both elected officials that I mentioned, as well as bureau leadership. The purpose originally of the group was to collectively address the rapidly rising costs of these services to the general fund and look for ways to work together to reduce these long-term costs. It seems like a long time ago that we organized that group, and the original charge has been expanded. Over the past 18 months, I don't think it's an overstatement to say that COVID and the racial justice movement have challenged us to think much more broadly about our work, and we move beyond the narrow scope of cost control to a much more ambitious plan of building an integrated system for a modern city, vastly different than our history of independent public safety bureaus. I want to thank the mayor again. I want to thank Commissioner Hardesty again. Those, particularly when Commissioner Hardesty brought public safety bureaus together in budget sessions, it was a good first sign that we can do a lot more together. I also want to thank Commissioner Mapps for as soon as he joined council for supporting this work. After 2 years of this effort and the initial formation of a new division to lead, I'm more convinced than ever that we have many opportunities to both better tailor our day-to-day services and the needs in the community. And we will reduce costs in some areas as well. In the interest of supporting that system change, as you already know, we hired Mike Myers to be our Community Safety Transition Director at the beginning of April. In less than 6 months, Mike has already made substantial progress in building the structure to enable these changes, while also playing a role to manage the many crises that we are facing this year. Mike has been working with a small team of employees who are currently on loan while working to build a permanent staff. Thank you to Chief Boone for lending this newly forming division both the supremely talented and dedicated Rich Chapman and Nate Takara, who have done invaluable work. I also want to recognize Julian Massenberg and Ruth Levine from my team for stepping up to lead in the interim as we hire the first employees for this new division. All of this has been done while creating a work plan that you will hear about today and helping on existing initiatives. So lots of work. It's truly a public sector startup, and they have been working nonstop. Before I turn it over to Director Myers to walk through the 4 focus areas, I want to tell you the 2 questions that I will ask all of you as our City Council at the end. 1, is this work plan, as it's outlined, meeting your expectations? Will it meet your expectations? And 2, how do you want to be engaged in this work going forward? Again, we want to ensure that you are informed and engaged. So I will ask you those 2 questions and any others that come up that we need to address, but please keep those in mind as Director Myers walks through the 4 action areas with you. Director Myers.
Well, Tom, thanks for the introductions, and I appreciate you identifying the individuals that are volunteering their time. And I'd be remiss if I didn't personally thank numerous people on the call today for just the extended help that we've received over the last 2 to 3 years. I've been with the city since 2016, and this has been just a long project, and we're just very excited about being here today. So, for the record, my name is Mike Myers. I am the Community Safety Transition Director for the City of Portland. As Tom stated, we have 4 action areas we'll be talking about today. Next slide, please. These are those action areas specifically, and Tom identified them already. We're going to talk about reducing calls for service and what that means to shrink the pool of emergency calls by supporting investments around vibrant communities. So we'll hear a little bit from Dr. J. We'll talk about the investments that we're making in community-based organizations with a highlight from Director Green from the Office of Violence Prevention. And we'll talk about other areas that I believe we can work to reduce calls for service. I've always said, if you don't manage the call volume will manage you. And as we grow and become a more modern community safety services division, we need to manage that call volume better. We'll talk about right responder for right call. I know this is something that's high on everybody's list to make sure that we're sending the appropriate responder to the calls. So I'll talk about a couple of projects that I'm working on there, and we'll have an introduction and some discussion around the hard work that Director Causey is doing in the Bureau of Emergency Communications. And then we'll talk about alternative emergency service models as we look to the future of community safety. How should we be delivering the services now and into the future to modernize how we do business? We'll be hearing from our Fire Chief Sarah Boone, who's already initiated, along with her Commissioner Hardesty, already innovative solutions. You might know one as such as Portland Street Response, but we'll be hearing about another one today. And then finally, number 4, just the larger governance question. I think we've made a lot of progress in the last 5 months since I've been with you, and I'm excited to announce our first step in consolidating some finance and budget options that I think will give us greater opportunity in the future to build on what we're trying to do. Next slide. So as I talk about these things today, I'll talk about each one independently. I'll introduce the speaker. We don't have work sessions are difficult. We only have 2 hours. They're usually very complex issues. I know there's going to be a lot of questions. We're totally at your will as commissioners and mayor on how you want to manage the questions. But my hope is that we could go through this slide, and then once the presenters are completed, we can answer a few questions directed to the presenters. And then as Director Reinhardt said, toward the end of the meeting, we will have a set opportunity to answer questions at large. So let's first talk about the very first item, and that is to reduce calls for service. And just if you think back to Tuesday, just a couple of days ago, we had a work session around mental health crisis response. And we talked a lot about how a call comes into 911. And we heard from Julie Dodge, the interim director of behavioral health, and she talked about the 988, 488 number. and the need for us to market that more. And that's just one example where we can team up with public health to really help residents of Portland know about different numbers and make the right call from the very onset. And we need to do a better job directing calls that are non-emergency, not necessarily to 911, but to a different location. And I know Director Reinhardt and I'm Michelle Koenig-Nortz on this call today. They are both working very hard on the 311 rollout. So we already have very good initiatives going and started on how we might reduce calls even coming into the 911 center. But once they get into the 911 center, we have an opportunity there to triage those, and we'll talk to Bob Causey, Director Causey, in just a little bit. I'd also like to highlight some of the other prevention efforts that we're doing. And I've asked Director Green from the Office of Violence Prevention to be here today and kind of share some of the highlights that she's been working on in her office. Director Green.
Thank you, Director Mike Myers. Again, I'm Nike Green. I am the Director of the Office of Violence Prevention. Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning. So I want to lean in 2020 and 2021 really taught us that, the adversity we face and the resilience that we respond with has the power to shape our lives. And with each challenge that we've had as a city and as individuals, we are given an opportunity to persevere, to learn, and to grow into stronger, not just individuals, but a stronger collective city that is more compassionate and keeps humanity at the forefront. So for better or worse, we've been changed. But what we've learned from that change is we've learned more about our health in light of COVID. We've learned more about family, work. We're in a Zoom call. Resilience and community, and again, humanity. And these lessons must carry us forward as we continue to address gun violence. We cannot lose those values. Our office has learned change is hard and change is necessary, and it's uncomfortable. But we choose not to take the easy path, to simply cover up or to change a name or to change people, but to lean in, stop looking for easy, and do what's necessary to keep the forefront of our community at our hearts. So today we remember the 46 lives this year alone that have been lost by gun violence. And we put them on the forefront of this conversation and dialogue to all of our communities and family members that houses have been riddled by gunfire, injury, shootings, hospital visits, graveyards, prisons, and memorials and vigils. Schoolyards that should be rung with the laughter of kids, but have been riddled with fear and anxiety. We lean in harder and more. So our Office of Violence Prevention, our gun violence goals are pretty much easy, and they're sixfold. Number one, gun violence is a public health issue. Number two, we lean into primary preventions, addressing root causes. Number three, focusing on high-risk individuals and places. Number four, breaking the cycle of violence. Number five, engaging in coordination and collaborative efforts, as you are hearing demonstrated today with all of the stakeholders and partners around public safety and gun violence. And number six, community mobilization and advocacy. So I just want to highlight a few things in the short amount of time that I have around the Office of Violence Prevention. In the lane of our primary prevention efforts, I want to highlight some of those social determinants and what we've been doing to address those. In the lines of education, our outreach workers focus on our youth and have had and strengthened partnerships with our schools to make sure that they are advocating and preventing violence before it happens. This is something that's been demonstrated by pro-social activities, group level work, cognitive behavioral referrals, one-on-one, family efforts, educational tools, and cultural specific services that we have seen through NAIA, through Latino Network, through POIC, through IRCL, through SACO, and many others. This year alone, we were able to, out of the Office of Violence Prevention, provide 13 Forging Ahead scholarships for college. Again, that social determinant, being able to give those seniors finances to make sure that they can, in spite of COVID, still move on to their secondary and their post-education. In environment, we had the benefit of teaming up with Civic Life and Mary Tompkins and the graffiti removal. And we went upstream and we were able to paint, literally. My painting skills may not be the best, but I definitely put them at work and removed some very harsh gang graffiti where they were crossing each other out and wanting to murder each other. And we were able to paint that building all around. And within 2 hours, unfortunately, that gang came back and it already tagged up. But guess what? We were right there. So thanks to Civic Life and the graffiti mover team and all of us that came out to really lessen and provide safer spaces and efforts to reduce repeated exposure to violence. Again, our faith communities, all upstream work, stopping violence before it happens, have galvanized and come together to help with relief services, with rental, housing units, being able to provide funding and investments for relocation services, food, and more. And both our office and others leaning into that effort by providing those investments and support. Community events. Oh, we took our finances and our funding and helped Royal Harris with his March Against Murder, Love is Stronger with their Unity in the Community events, the Soul Box Project, using art as a medium to advocate and educate our community about the traumatic impact of gun violence, World Stage Theater with Shalonda Sims and Third World Repertoire Theater presenting plays around the impact of gun violence and what we can do and how we can mobilize together as a community. And so then we also had our back to school event where we had multiple partners from Moms Demand Action, Head Start, NEA, Pacific Islander Community Association, the Soul Box Project, and Multnomah County School-Based Health Center, and more, Latino Network, cultural dancers, giving out backpacks, supporting the community, and providing resources as they transition back to school, helping answer questions on what they can do to stay safe in their communities and in their schools alike. And I can't highlight everything because of time, but I just want us to know that there's so many different arenas. In our secondary prevention, which many we talk about focusing on those high-risk people and places, being able to bring on these life coaches who can provide intensive case management through our office as well as through the ordinance fund that was passed by this council to make sure that we now have over 20 highest risk individuals who are connected with a life coach, who are engaged in an 18-month relationship that can help them put a life plan together and make those hard decisions so that they can be the best person that they want to be. And they can do that not alone, but with the support, the resources, and that person right next to them that's been through it, understands that lived experience, and has that expertise guiding them along the way. And we thank those partners from PYC to Going Home to SACO and many others so that we can reduce our visitations to the graves, the prisons, and most importantly, no more deaths and less in the hospital revisits. Speaking of hospitals, we're excited to announce, many of you have been hearing us, PYC's Healing Hurt People Hospital Response Program was in the beginning just at Emmanuel Hospital, that one trauma level. And now we're at OHSU and Emmanuel, and Legacy has expanded to Mount Hood so that we can continue to make sure our partners can serve those families impacted by gun violence across the spectrum that goes from East County all the way to North Portland, and we appreciate that. Lastly, to highlight just breaking the cycle of violence, which is around our tertiary preventions, and being able to announce that with our Portland Restoration Academy, one of our goals about our interns who have lived experience in a entering into our community and transitioning out of prison, one of our interns has already been hired for full employment and is now actually one of our life coaches with one of our partner programs. So again, we wanted to make sure that when we have individuals coming out, that they don't have barriers around economics and that they can get a long-term sustainable employment. And that has already happened. So we're excited to announce again those successes. A special thank you out to all of our partners. Normally what I do is I highlight all the organizations, but I want to first say this. Many of our partners are not agencies, but they're individuals just like you and I, just like those that are listening in today and watching online, who show up every single day, lending their hands and feet to this work, lending their skills, their trainings and time and money to the work, and they don't get paid for it. And they show up every day. Some of them are families of victims. Some of them are neighbors. Some of them are just us waking up and saying, how can I help? And they have spoken up and they have showed up relentlessly in these past 2 years to find ways to comfort loved ones, to dry tears, to provide interview help. So some of those I will name for Moms Demand Action, our Multnomah County commissioners, our city commissioners, Everytown USA, Portland Public Schools, David Douglas School District as well, NAA, PYC, ERCO, Latino Network, Love is Stronger, Elevate Oregon, Books Not Bars, Latino Network, our state reps, Representative Bynum and Lou Fredericks, and others. Lastly, I just want to remind you guys that we are here and we're excited to lean collectively to combat gun violence and continue to do the heavy lifting and to mobilize our community and allow them to lead the effort because they know what we should do. Thank you.
Director Green, thank you for giving us a highlight on the work that OVP is doing. We really are very much appreciative of that. Commissioner Mapps, you have a question?
If this is an appropriate time, I do have a question for Director Green.
Certainly.
This is Director Green, thank you so much for that presentation, and thank you so much for the important work that your team does. One of my goals on this council is to come up with a set of public safety reforms that reduces the number of gun homicides that we see in the city of Portland by 20% in the next 15 months. Can you offer us some advice on what we need to change and what we need to do in order to reduce the number of shootings that we have by 20% in the next 15 months?
I won't land into the 15th month time frame, but I will say this. In order for us to reduce gun violence in the short term, we must have a collective effort. All stakeholders must be at the table. It is an all hands on deck approach that allows us to reduce gun violence in the near term. That's about prevention lanes and the root cause. That's about downstream work where we're making sure that we are addressing those that are at the highest risk. That's the law enforcement side. That's the criminal justice side. That's the reform. All those pieces need to be in place, and we need to lean in hard and make sure that everybody is consistently at the table addressing those issues. So however we show up, we know what we're doing in a very precise way. Focus our areas on those peoples and places that are at highest risk, making sure the right people are at the table providing those services and making sure those most impacted are leading this work, and we are constantly learning from them. And of course, data informed.
Director Green and Commissioner Mapps, that's a perfect segue into our next speaker, Dr. Jonathan Jay from Boston University. And I want to say this before he pulls up his slide set. Team, I'm very aware that many of you have seen Dr. Jay's presentations in the past, and many of you are aware and know fully well the positive impacts upstreaming has on the built environment and on communities increasing, that we create vibrancy in communities. I know you know that. This is what's different with the work that Jonathan Jay has been doing over the last 5 months with us as we've kind of rolled out this community safety division. He is working on a project called ShapeUp. The important part about this project is Dr. Jay is able to pinpoint locations where, of course, the gun violence is occurring, but more importantly, where people that are doing the gun violence live, work, and play. And it's where we think we need to invest in built environment improvements in urban design in those locations. And that's the difference. If we can identify these locations and work with city bureaus across the entire city to bring their infrastructure improvement dollars, whether it's sidewalks, whether it's tree canopy, whether it's digital divide, whatever dollars that we have from bureaus doing specific work, if we can align those and invest those in the locations that we are identifying in ShapeUp, that's the big difference. That's what's not being done across the United States. And I think that's the big deal that I'd like Dr. Jay to share with us today. Jonathan, it's always a pleasure to have you. And thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here again with you. I'll be talking, as Director Myers just said, I'll be talking about one slice of that violence prevention picture that Director Green was talking about, specifically the built environment. So we know that community violence has factors that are individual, interpersonal, and occur at the household level. But as Director Green was saying, one reason that we talk about social determinants of health is that community context matters too. And for the built environment in particular, the built environment shapes where people come across each other, under what conditions, and has been a really important leverage point for effective violence prevention interventions. So you all have heard some of this, some of you have heard this from me before, but we have evidence that turning vacant, unkempt vacant lots into simple, small green spaces is associated with substantial reductions in gun violence. Nearby, a recent study found that relatively small grants to homeowners to do physical repairs to their homes was associated with drops in gun homicides on the same block. These are sort of the cutting edge findings in this field, but this research goes back many years. There is evidence from Los Angeles about changing road traffic patterns in places that had a number of drive-by shootings, and findings that the amount of green space around apartment buildings in Chicago influenced whether those places were safe or unsafe, independent of other characteristics of the neighborhoods or the people who lived in the buildings. One innovative intervention that's being used widely in Chicago, also increasingly in DC, and Newark and other places, is having paid community members work to monitor the spaces where children use to walk to school, has been associated with reductions in violence at those times and places that are most important for children's violence exposure. Why does this work? In contrast to broken windows theory, which you may be familiar with, one of my colleagues at the University of Michigan has coined the idea of busy streets theory. This is the idea that these interventions work by making neighborhoods feel safer to the people who live there, such that they are able to use public spaces, get to know each other, solve problems, monitor their own neighborhoods, not in a harsh surveillance type of way, but in a collective action, collective efficacy way. And so that's one way that interventions that we talk about, some of which are focused on vacant spaces, which may not be as much of a problem in Portland, the same lessons can be applied to Portland based on this idea of making streets busier, more vibrant, and therefore safer. I'm talking today specifically about ShapeUp, which is a project that I've been working on that is primarily an analytical tool to prioritize these kinds of environmental interventions as one slice of a broader gun violence prevention strategy. So the reason that we came up with this was that we know that these interventions work, but there have been very few resources, no similar existing tool to identify which places we should be working on from the many options that we're going to have in a big city like Portland, and which interventions we should use there, knowing that there are multiple possible options for changing the built environment to make it safer. We launched this project with $100,000 in funding from Every Town for Gun Safety through a competitive process. And we started by working with the city of Albany, New York, which I'll talk about in a moment. The main innovation that we brought to the table with this tool was the ability to analyze tons of data about the built environment in a standardized, rigorous, quick way that pulls in a lot of detail without having to do the work of going block to block, door to door, collecting information about the environment. That can be done, and it has been done, but it's very costly and time consuming. And even those data that you collect in that way can be limited. So that's a possibility to talk about, but this is an alternative method from someone like me who has spent a fair amount of time doing those manual environmental audits and wanted a more scalable way of doing it. It is computationally advanced in that we are turning these photographs, like ones that you and I can look at, into data that algorithms, machine learning algorithms can process. This is using a pre-trained convolutional neural network, which is an image classifier. The proof of concept work here is from Philadelphia, where you can see that we use the process that I just described, taking every city block and converting it into data using these algorithms, and then running a statistical model to identify high risk and low risk places. One way of visualizing it, you can see on the left here, low risk places look like in Philadelphia. They have some of them at the top left and bottom right. They look almost suburban, although they're inside city limits. You see one space that's sort of an empty industrial space where very little is going on. And then downtown, where in fact in Philadelphia there's relatively low gun violence incidents. By contrast, what the model learned about high-risk places is that they're much higher density. They have more vacant lots, as we would expect, less green space, more concrete. They've been systematically disinvested from. And we see that that systematic physical disinvestment is associated with higher gun violence. We didn't just want to visualize, we generated predictions for every city block in Philadelphia, and then went back and saw if those were accurate against a set of data that we had held out. And what we see compared to sort of traditional policing, statistical approaches that police departments often use, which tend to be blurry, they're identifying these sort of big hotspots. We can get very granular by analyzing each block individually and picking out what we know, which is that violence risk can vary from block to block within the same neighborhood. And what we found is that purely as a predictive model, this approach outperforms those traditional predictive approaches. And I'll talk about how we're about to work those kinds of predictions into a program. In Albany, this was our first shot working this into city processes associated with violence prevention. So that's a city government that, and in particular, the buildings department, that has really adopted a data-driven mentality. Albany has high vacancy rates, which were believed to be associated with higher gun violence incidents, like we've seen in other cities. And the buildings department had identified 27 abandoned, physically distressed buildings that they would be able to demolish because they had sort of gone through the whole process to get ownership. And but they only had the resources to do 5 or 10 demolitions. So this is sort of a classic prioritization problem of where can we have the greatest benefits? And the the neighborhood stabilization coordinator said, we want gun violence prevention to be one piece of the picture that we bring to these decisions. So we conducted the ShapeUp analysis that I just described for every city block and specifically for all of those 27 demolitions candidates. We made some fancy maps, but more importantly, what we were able to do is give a very granular picture of what gun violence risk looks like. We incorporated both the aerial imagery and additional information that they have at the city level on vacancy and the locations of liquor stores to predict risk. And then in particular, to feed into this process around prioritizing demolitions, we compared each of those 27 buildings for the score. But the key part is that here was their process. So we gave them all of those scores. Then the neighborhood stabilization coordinator, who's part of the buildings department, went to the neighborhood associations for the 3 neighborhoods from which these candidate buildings had been selected. These are all historically redlined, currently racial and economically marginalized neighborhoods, where the building department's perception was that residents wanted these demolitions. This isn't what you might imagine in terms of large-scale demolitions to clear the way for development. This house is falling down. It's an eyesore. It makes me feel unsafe to walk by. You need to do something about this. So that's what they came in with. So they gave a bunch of information about each candidate to the relevant neighborhood organization. One of those neighborhood organizations said, we don't want any of these buildings demolished. And I think that was sort of a combination of not wanting the demolitions activity and not being particularly impressed with the candidates in their neighborhood. And so none were done there. In the other 2 neighborhoods, they voted and they wanted the demolitions and they voted. Their final selections included most of our very highest rated, the buildings that were highest rated using ShapeUp, and a couple of them were much lower, medium to low relative risk compared to the other ones. And that's exactly what we had in mind. When we look at this picture, we see that ShapeUp scores helped guide this process, or at least aligned with neighborhood residents' perspectives on what high risk look like and what priorities look like. And the final decisions incorporated other factors too. And this is what we propose for Portland and Toledo and everywhere that we're working now. So that was working on version 1 of this tool. We're now into version 2, working with you all in Portland and working with the new mayor's gun violence prevention initiative in Toledo, Ohio. Like in Albany, we're trying to identify priority locations, like Director Meyer said. But in Albany, they knew which intervention they wanted to use. They wanted to do demolitions. In Portland and Toledo, we want to help inform those conversations about what is the right intervention at a given location. And so part of what's in the deal for us at BU for this project is having the opportunity to do more in-depth analysis in both of these cities to enhance our algorithm to do that specific thing, to identify risk and protective factors citywide and how they apply in a given location. We have completed the first step, which was site visits with Roy Moore from POIC, who I know some of you know, and Andre Miller from Commissioner Hardesty's office and some of their colleagues. And so we went through a lot of, got to hear a lot from them about how different factors link with violence risk. We have the analytics process mapped out. We're waiting for data from PPB that goes beyond what's currently available on their open data portal. We need a little more precision around geographic location and victim characteristics. And then if we can sort of get that on track, we will have these analyses. That first piece with the images is quick. That will only take a couple of weeks once we have the right data. And then another few months after that to get that next piece of the analysis. So hopefully looking into the early part of 2022 for community consultation and choosing interventions. Thank you very much. I'm eager to take any questions or address any concerns.
Always a pleasure to have you, Dr. J. Thank you for that concise presentation. Commissioner Hardesty.
Thank you, Mike and Director Myers, and thank you so much, Dr. J. I had a question around, you made a statement about physical disinvestment predicts gun violence. What predicts physical disinvestment? And how does ShapeUp address those root causes?
In many of the cities that we've worked in, physical disinvestment is highest in the neighborhoods that are most affected by racial segregation. I talked about historic redlining as one of these sort of root causes, especially in cities. But there's a lot of factors that include local government decisions, state and federal government decisions, and that is one way of looking at all of this environment work, is really just remediating the effects of a legacy of physical disinvestment from the neighborhoods where people of color live.
Commissioner Mapps.
Dr. J, thank you so much for this presentation and very exciting and interesting work. Can you talk more about the particular interventions that might be appropriate for Portland? I can understand in like Rust Belt cities, demolitions of old buildings might be an option. I think that's probably not a great fit for Portland. So what are some of the things that we might be able to do that fit Portland's unique character?
I don't want to jump too far ahead of the analysis, but just as an example of something that we heard from, thank you for the question, one thing that we heard from the neighborhood organization in Southeast was that one of the challenges to sort of activating people in public spaces there was the speed of traffic coming down major roadways that cut right through the community in spaces that they'd like to use. And so that would be one example of the kind of environmental factor that we're hearing is associated with lack of physical safety. And we also talked at length about how that could be associated with gun violence incidents in particular in various ways, and where we have a range of existing interventions, some of which are relatively simple to implement, not at least from a physical perspective. And those are the kinds of questions that we want to address, particularly in a way that's informed by our analysis.
Maybe if I could follow up. I understand how your analysis will help us highlight essentially hotspots in the city and maybe even some of the physical characteristics around these that describe or shared amongst different hotspots. But how does your analysis lead us to what the right intervention is, whether it's calming traffic or, planting a park? Or demolishing a building. It sounds like you're doing some community outreach there too, but which frankly didn't come through real clear in the presentation. That's fine, but yeah, how does your method lead to at least a basket of interventions?
As you say, the analysis will point towards the factors in a particular location that stand out in that location. And so that I see this as an analysis that can highlight a set of issues on the menu for action that is deeply engaged with community members, and as Director Green mentioned, the sort of all hands on deck mentality, which will include planners, architects, other community members, local businesses, faith community. There's a lot of reason to think that those solutions, even if there were 2 or 3 options that maybe the data would have pointed to, that the one that the community members choose and implement will be more effective than any of the others.
Commissioner Mapps, maybe to add some more confidence for your question, we weren't prepared to bring the group here today, but we've had very good conversations with the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability and their interest to find the right investments that need to go into the neighborhoods. And these are the exact questions that you're asking. I think what we're going to find is tree canopies low, walk scores are low, access to healthy foods where people are walking to mini marts to shop. We're going to find all those common elements. And that describes disinvestment. We're going to find all of the social issues also. We're going to see poverty, joblessness. That's what we're going to see. The point is that we're going to be able to find where these locations are at. And then the hard work starts for all of us. Can we bring the city bureaus together when they have investments for money for sidewalks, they have investments for new grocery store, they have investments for digital divide work? Where are we going to put those dollars when we know where we need to put them? And I think that's going to be the hard conversation, Commissioner, that we need to have. And again, this is all squarely under the very first action step of reducing calls for service by creating environments that are vibrant, where people don't fall into positions of no hope and they choose to pick up a gun rather than go do something else. And we want to create those communities where people can prosper here in Portland. So Dr. J, thank you so much. I know you've been doing a lot of work for us for the last 5 years. This is new work. We're really encouraged and excited, and we'll continue to have you back. And thank you again for joining us today. We're going to move on to Director Causey's part in the next section, and he's going to bring up his slide set. Bob, we're running a little behind, but as Bob gets set up, I want to finalize the last work area around reducing calls for service. I want you all to know, as you issued out the gun violence reduction ordinance on April 7th, a number of you, Commissioner Rubio, I need to thank your team, specifically Rico on your staff, for leading the charge on the gun violence reduction ordinance team. We meet weekly, but that team has finally, it's been a long time. We've done a lot of good work. I got the awarded dollars out. I think we're down to the final amount of 600,000 ready to be awarded to community-based organizations that are going to do new work with the city. And it's just been a tremendous amount of work to get done, to get those dollars awarded out appropriately. I want you to know also, I appreciate everybody's help around the ARPA funds. We were able over the last 5 months to get an additional $1 million of gun violence reduction money allotted to new community-based organizations that will be rolling those monies out as well. And I want to remind everybody that this is the second work session of 3. You have a third work session coming up on November 2nd that will specifically talk about gun violence reduction. Next up, we have Bob Causey. Director Causey is the director of the Bureau of Emergency Communications. He's going to lead us off on a discussion around the right responder to the right call. Director Causey has been working on this project for many years since the day he came here. He and I have been tandemly working on it together. And Director Causey, can you give us your update? And just as you know, we're running just a slight tad bit behind.
Yeah, thank you, Director Myers, and Mayor and Commissioners. It is an honor to be here today, and I really do appreciate this opportunity. To kick things off, I really want to talk about the current state and the reality that we're living in, because that really is the elephant in the room. There's been a lot of negative press about 911, about public safety, community safety in general. And I want to talk a little bit about the problem so that we can begin to have a conversation about what I see some solutions are, particularly when we're looking at 911 and public safety response. So we know we have a current service level problem. 911 calls are holding. That is really primarily due to anywhere from a 20 to a 45% weekly increase in our 911 call volume. That 45% week was the first heat wave that we experienced. And when I look at a comparison, 45% more calls in that week compared to the same week the previous year, I even go back to 2019 to do a more holistic comparison. And obviously, 45% increase is unsustainable. When we think about any kind of increase, for our Bureau to be able to continue providing the service we need, I would say maybe 1 or 2% as an outlier, and then going back to the norm. That would be more absorbable. But when we're looking at numbers like we've been looking at this summer, it really has become unsustainable. We also have implemented ProQA, and many of you are aware of that. ProQA is a new medical and fire triage protocol that under normal circumstances, it's always a challenge to learn new protocols. But when you're faced with the increase in 911 calls and the sheer volume of business that we're having to conduct, learning that protocol has been a real challenge for our staff. We haven't been able to provide adequate feedback to the staff because we don't have time to meet with them. That's one of the primary reasons. They're so busy answering 911 calls that we can't even afford them time off the floor to go over calls for service with them. We also recently lost about a dozen employees for a variety of reasons. Anytime you implement a new protocol, you can anticipate that folks who are eligible to retire will most likely choose to do so, and we did experience that. In addition to that, though, because of the extreme workload, a number of employees have experienced burnout. We've had some that have requested leaves of absence. We've also had some internal promotions, which is always something good to celebrate. The problem is it impacts our staffing. And we've also had just some general resignations over the past 6 months or so. So here's our current setting, and I've said this before many times. We are the Bureau of Emergency Communications. There is no Bureau of Non-Emergency Communications. Our call volume is around 1 million calls per year, and about half of them are non-emergency or administrative calls. That's why I make that statement. There is no Bureau of Non-Emergency Communications, but we are placed in the position of handling non-emergency calls, not only for the city, but really for the entire county, because we provide 911 and non-emergency services, as well as dispatch services for the entirety of Multnomah County. Now, the chart to the right really demonstrates the reality of the 911 call increase. You can see in 2019, we handled around 149,000 911 calls during the months of June, July, and August. Same time frame last year was a slight decrease. That slight decrease is fairly negligible, about 1,000, 1,200 calls over the course of the summer. But then look at this year, 183, almost 184,000 911 calls that our center has processed. That is a 24 average, 24.07% increase to our call volume. So this translates to long wait times. Way back in December, we were at 19 seconds. People calling 911, that falls within the national standard. And then it started creeping up. The 40-second mark in February is primarily due to the winter storm, if you remember that. During the winter storm, we received record numbers of calls. So that ticked that number up, but then it went back down to March, and then slowly as summer approached, started increasing to the point that we're averaging, and this is average, about a minute wait time. That doesn't really tell the story, because during peak call times, when we have a significant event, some callers are experiencing a 4-minute wait, a 5-minute wait, or even longer. And if it's your worst day, the worst day of your life, and you're calling for help, you want someone to be able to pick up the phone right away. You don't want to wait a minute, let alone 5 minutes or more. So this is how calls are processed right now. I mentioned earlier, we're answering 911 calls and non-emergency and administrative calls for the entire county. Here's the bottleneck. We have call takers that are answering all of those calls. And then if it is an administrative call that needs to be handled elsewhere, we transfer the caller out to other bureaus or other agencies. Again, the bottleneck being here because all of those calls are funneling to us. This is not uncommon nationwide. 911 centers have the infrastructure, they have the employees, and many municipalities, and certainly in my experience with a lot of different 911 centers, the mindset is give it to dispatch, they can handle it. And that's really what's happened here. And we really need to rethink that because it has become unsustainable, as I mentioned earlier. So how can things operate? And this is my vision. It's a full disclosure and a disclaimer that this is kind of Bob's world and how I'd like to see things happen. But you can see here that the call taker is still here answering non-emergency or answering 911 emergency calls. Everything else, in my mind, should go to 311. And here's why. We ran some data on our non-emergency calls. Only about 20 to 25% of those calls result in a dispatched call for service. Everything else is a referral or some kind of call that would otherwise be handled by 311. So to make things easy for our community, there really should just be the two numbers, 911 for emergencies and 311 for everything else. 311 operator then can determine if police need to respond on a non-emergency. Remember, this is non-emergency, so they shouldn't be calling with an emergency to 311 to begin with. But that call taker can then transfer the call to us on our non-emergency line, and we're only having to process about 25% of our current non-emergency call volume. There's also a little bit later in my presentation, I'll talk about app-based reporting or web-based reporting for lower priority calls. Well, there are some steps that need to be taken in order to migrate calls to 311. We have a really good partnership already with the 311 program, and we just need to make sure that continues. In addition to that, 311's hours of operation need to expand into the evening and the weekends so that they really are fully operational to be able to fit into this bigger picture. At that point, then we'll be able to transfer the customer service components of non-emergency to 311. Steps 3, 4, and 5 really can occur almost simultaneously because at that point, they can be integrated into the overall system, and we need to launch a coordinated community awareness campaign. And I would would say that it has to involve 911, but it also needs to involve 311, 211, and the suicide prevention line 988.
If we're at a good place for a break, the mayor has a question, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Mayor?
Yeah, Director Causey, thank you so much for this. I appreciate the update. Could you tell us, I'm still looking at the slide here, the 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 steps. This council is obviously uniformly supportive of the 311 system. For a number of years, we have been funding this program. What do you need to move this and move it more quickly? And to be specific, are you prepared to make an ask either for the fall bump or for the upcoming budget process?
The ask that we have in the bump is specific to BOEC, but what we would need for 311 to be incorporated is for 311 staffing capabilities to be increased pretty drastically. And I know Michelle Kunick North is also with us today. She can probably speak to that more clearly than I can. But
I would like that answer. If we can get it now, that would be great. Only because I think all of us on the council recognize that between street response and 311, those are two obvious ways that we can both we can solve two problems simultaneously. We can reduce the reliance on the police, number one, and deploy non-police alternatives. And number two, it gives us an opportunity to, as you point out, use the BOEC call center more effectively and make sure calls are getting to the right people quickly, and thus freeing up the 911 line and the dispatchers for true emergencies. So I think we're all committed. Now the question just is, what do you need from us to get it done?
Mayor, if I can interrupt, we thought this question might come up today. Director Reinhardt, we know we want to shift some calls from 911. We want them to go to 311. I know you have been working with Michelle Kunick North on what that might look like. Do you have any idea on what an ask might look like, or is that something we would need to get back to the mayor on?
We have Michelle on. Let's let Michelle give us her take on this. Michelle.
Yeah, hi. Michelle Kunick North, 311 Program Manager. Thanks for having me. I have done some, well, let me back up. So when council approved the 311 program back in 2019, starting with the 2020-21 fiscal year, it adopted an escalation in our staffing. And at that time, we assumed that we would be working with BOEC to take part of this non-emergency load. So part of the calls are already kind of assumed in our base budget. Looking at just our standard hours of operation and our upcoming work on community awareness campaigns and some other initiatives that we're doing, I think that we could start to get somewhere between 30 and 50% of those non-dispatch, non-emergency calls over to our center within our current staffing plan. If we start to look at kind of additive improvements beyond that, either extending hours further or 24/7, that's where we start to look at some additional staff, likely in the 10 to 15 FTE range.
And could you just give us a really quick thumbnail of what the likelihood is of being able to hire those individuals in this environment, and what sort of training is required before they're deployable?
My side, but I did not hear that question.
I think, Mayor, you're breaking up, but I think what the mayor's asking is, assuming that council supports a staffing expansion, what's the likelihood of being able to hire 10 to 15 employees, train them, timeline? And mayor's trying to get a sense of that. I think
and Tom, what sort of training is required?
And training requirement, yes.
So we have 5 recruitments ongoing now with an additional 9 planned this fiscal year and next fiscal year for our call takers. We've generally been on about 7 per year expansion plan. So I think we have capability to continue that path. In terms of training, what we're finding in our work with BOEC is that the majority of the non-emergency calls that do not result in an incident or a dispatch from their call taker are things that 311 tends to handle now anyway. So there are some areas where we're doing some enhanced training, but this isn't a significant service onboarding and training process.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Commissioner Maps.
A quick question, because I know we're short on time, and maybe it will go to both. We'll start with Bob, and then maybe go to Michelle. Director Causey, according to can you give me a recommended timeline for completing the entire migration of non-emergency over to 311? And then I'd like to hear the folks over at 311 respond to that timeline.
Yeah, this summer has really beat us up, and we need to have relief in sight, certainly by next summer. Otherwise, I'm afraid we'll be burning people out so drastically that we'll probably end up in the hole again next year. And that's provided things stay the same. If we see another 20% or more increase, all bets are off. What I would venture to say is, and this is certainly more idealistic of me, is as initiatives begin to work, as some of the, particularly the initiatives we're talking about today, but the initiatives even that I have in mind for BOEC, then we'll be able to gauge better the real number of FTE that we need and what our true call volume will be. Ultimately, I want to see 311 fully operational in my mind. Like I said, this is Bob's way of doing business, but where they are the go-to number for all calls, administrative and non-emergency, and then transfer calls that need a police response to us. I'd like to see that in place by next summer.
And could I get someone over at 311 to tell us about the whether or not you're equipped to take a significant number of our non-emergency calls by next summer?
So looking at having that public education campaign in place, I think we're in the 60,000 calls a year range with our current staffing levels. That's only a portion of those non-emergency calls, and that's kind of this current, by the end of this current fiscal year, with additional components planned for next fiscal year. The other thing I might say is there's 2 ways to look at this. With a community awareness campaign that encourages folks to call 311 for non-emergency needs, we may end up with hold times at 311. But I would argue that that's with a significantly lower risk to the community than having those folks on hold, either with the non-emergency line or 911.
So a couple quick points. Thank you, Michelle. Commissioner Maps, your questions are leading us down a path that we have all been talking about with the Community Safety Division. So it's a matter of planning this out and putting together the right resourcing, the right training. We know Director Causey is doing all he can. We know Michelle has an excellent plan, and now we're trying to figure out how we can shift that and maybe accelerate it. And I want to point out that the great thing for me in my position is that we were not having these discussions 2 years ago. We had no possibility of any of this type of thinking. So I want to credit the leaders again that we're in this position. We are in the right position now to figure out how to migrate these calls. I'm confident that we will figure it out. We will bring you a proposal on how to do that. I'll put it in the next steps of the work session. I do want to point out, though, that every council member oversees different bureaus and offices. Most of them are already migrating other calls to 311. So we also have difficult choices there to make around parks and PBOT and others, that the service is very much in demand. and people are voting with their feet or their keyboard clicks, or I don't know what the right metaphor is, but the service is very popular. So we will make a proposal to council about maybe sequencing some of that in terms of the priorities that you were identifying here. I'm guessing that the council will say, we've got a life and death situation for Portlanders in terms of the current situation of the Bureau of Emergency Communication. So in the interest of time, I'd like to accelerate that and just say, we're going to put this in next steps. Bob, am I correct in that is?
Yeah, that's a very good
thrust of
assessment.
your, okay.
So continuing on, there's other technology that we are looking into that actually we're really beginning to move forward on. The first one is through our computer-aided dispatch vendor, Versaterm. They have a service called Case Service, which the reason that bullet point is kind of purple there, it's actually a link to their web page, and it describes what this is. And Case Service is for non-emergency police related calls, allows the community member to either through an app, through the web portal, or by phone to access, for all intents and purposes, an artificial intelligence, artificial officer, even if you will, and be able to go through a series of triage questions that will provide information for that caller. For example, if there is a low priority cold burglary call, the community member can access that on through the website. It would run them through a series of questions, provide them a case number, and that information spills into the police bureau's RMS system, or records management system. At that point, then they can have someone pretty similar to, and again, this is Bob's way of thinking. Okay, I'm just throwing that out there, but they could have someone pretty similar to the police liaison who's here at BOEC. Look at those calls and make a determination. Do they need to call that person back, provide any additional resources? Does the website just provide the information that that person needs? There's a lot of flexibility with that, and the police bureau can write the rules for it. All three of the agencies that we dispatch for, PPB, as well as Gresham Police and Multnomah County Sheriff's Office, viewed the demo. Multnomah County Sheriff's Office is moving forward with the application. Gresham is interested, and I know that PPB has expressed interest as well. In addition to that, what this does for BOEC is it prevents those non-emergency police calls from even having to come to us. Now, this is something that the caller can do on their own through the webpage, or they can do it through the phone app as well. Or perhaps someone at 311 can walk them through that process. It's really the same result. It's reducing the call volume into BOEC so that our call takers can be freed up to answer real emergencies. And then finally, a couple more. The first, the second one on the list is automated secure alarm protocol. We answer an awful lot of alarm calls throughout the day. It takes our call takers time. Those calls are prioritized over others, not over 911, but over other calls, and they take a lot of our time. Those alarm companies that subscribe to that service can really just spill the data into our computer-aided dispatch system, and we can dispatch on those alarms without ever having to talk to someone at the alarm company. And finally, the abandoned callback feature. It's an automated feature that when somebody calls 911 and they hang up, we have to call them back. And over this summer, that's about 20% of our workload. It takes a lot longer to queue up those calls and make the calls to the person who's hung up on 911 for a variety of reasons than it does just to be able to answer the phone to begin with. So by implementing this callback feature, we can write the rules on how that works. If it calls the person back one time, they would verify if they have an emergency. If they do, they go right back into the 911 queue. If they don't, we've conducted the callback. If there's no response, we then would most likely put them in a queue for a call taker to give them a call back. So that's some of the, yeah.
Yep. I'm going to interrupt you real quick. We might have to move on, but I want Commissioner Hardesty to get her question in. And
Yes, I
thank
put
you.
this question, thank you very much, Director Myers. I put this question in the chat and it was about the Pro QA training for police. Is there a timeline for that? My understanding is that if once we add police, we will be able to better triage whether it's appropriate to send police to that call.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you, Commissioner Hardesty. Implementing ProQA medical and fire over this summer has proven to be a real challenge because of the call volume. So what we've chosen to do, rather than place that additional burden on our staff to change the protocol for police calls, that's on hold at this point. And we're revisiting it, determining how that fits into our strategic plan, and making a decision a little bit later.
So Bob, we're going to move on. I know you could probably share a dozen more important things you're doing there. You have so much important work you're doing, and we're so appreciative of all the hard work you and your staff are dedicating to this. You are the critical link, and we're well aware of that. But I think what we need to do is have you back, and we'll go even farther and deeper into some of the unique work that you're doing. And thanks for being with us here this afternoon.
My pleasure.
Team, I'm going to move on to the next item. I want to make sure we get to our community panel. They've been waiting patiently. I want to make one last point real quick regarding the right responder, right call. In Community Safety Division, I do feel like we have enough money to do this next project. I want to hire out a consultant to come in and really evaluate the total call volume for the city. Every call that's coming in, and is it allocated to the right service provider? I mean, I think I know when I look through just having 30 plus years in the business, but I want to have some outside party come in and validate that. So I want to let you know that we will be working on that as well. Bob, thank you again. We're going to move on now to Chief Boone. Chief Boone has offered several innovative solutions in her time with us. And Chief, we're so happy you're here. I know you have a couple of colleagues that are with you. They're going to talk about another idea that you have, an alternative emergency service model that you wanted to share with us.
Great. Thank you, Director Myers. And good afternoon, Mayor Wheeler, elected officials. It's an honor to be here, as always. And I just want to ground this of where we are today. A lot of the discussion we're talking about the downstream side of 911. These are who's the appropriate responder, what's the right type of call, how are we shifting the load? And so I want everybody to realize where the unique position where Portland Fire sits. And one of the visions we have had as a department, as I've stepped into this role, is to make sure that we look at the upstream side. And that as part of our overall mission, that we have to evolve from a place of emergency response alone to where preventative community health becomes a fundamental part of our overall mission. In the past couple of years, or I should say 18 months, as we've all been trying to meet the demands, especially with COVID. For Portland Fire, we have wildfires. We also are a partner and work, whether it's heat emergencies, whether it's cold weather emergencies. There's a whole host of things, and trying to preserve our core services. But we are breaking as well. This is why we're talking about the response side, types of calls, all of that. But I really want to shift the focus of this discussion of upstream and prevention, because that's where we know as a licensed healthcare provider that we can connect with community, we can connect with Multnomah County Health, we can connect with health systems, nonprofits, community-based organizations, and really tailoring care to meet the needs of a community on an individual level. And so just as some of the electeds have heard before, when we talk about preventative strategies and upstream programs, these are things like when it comes to COVID testing, we had to expand the scope of who we were as EMTs under a medical director and partnership that we were able to vaccinate over 30,000 people that didn't fall into the hospital side. So this is where we're focused and targeted in the pre-hospital setting and the upstream preventative measures. And so I'd like to turn it over. I have community health coordinator, Lisa Reslock, as well as Deputy Chief Tim Matthews, that are going to talk about the next innovative upstream program and the partnership that will really transform where we are today. Lisa.
Well, thank you, Chief Boone, Mayor, and elected officials. My name is Lisa Reslock. I've been with Portland Fire and Rescue 26 years. Currently, I'm the Community Health Coordinator. I'm also a nurse at Emmanuel Hospital. Really, for the past 4 years specifically, Portland Fire and Rescue has looked at ways to address what we're speaking about, which is the increased low acuity call volume and low acuity in innovative ways. We've done two things that we want to talk to you about today, and that is how can we address the rise in these non-emergency calls, and how can we pay for it? I'm going to touch on something Commissioner Hardesty was asking, and she says, what are the increased call-related community issues, right? So, in other words, how did we get here? In all the things that we're discussing today, we have to ask ourselves as a city, how did we get here? And one of the main things that has happened is the health literacy, and I'm going to define that for everyone. The health literacy in our community means how we as community members access healthcare. Mental health, physical health, behavioral health. How do people access services to primary care physicians? So in the last decade, health literacy issues in our population have caused community members to call 911 for any and all of their health care, whether an emergency or not. So as you all know, this has caused a reciprocating door to and from EDs, emergency rooms, without health outcome improvement. And what we've evaluated is this is expensive for cities, right? It's expensive for first responder agencies, but more importantly, it's expensive to health systems. Now, health systems are the payers of the population. They're the ones that are tasked with like the Medicare and the Medicaid system, and they're also tasked with community health outcomes. So with regard to that, we wanted to, as a city, partner with a health system to help conquer this goal that we have, to help pay for a model, to help prevent calls from occurring, and to basically transform the system. So we don't have to always focus on responses. We can move into the prevention model and have a payment partner with us. I'm going to hand this off to Chief Tim Matthews in a second, but one statistic I want to leave you with is that 91% of all individuals that are transported to the hospital don't need to get admitted, which means they're sent home. So the model that I'm going to discuss right now that we have a partnership with Care Oregon is going to discuss how we can address the needs of the population and how we can get it paid for. Chief Matthews.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Lisa. I'm Deputy Chief Tim Matthews with Portland Fire. So I'm going to keep this really brief and we can get into questions later. We submitted a proposal to Care Oregon, like Lisa says, and it is to use a community health assess and treat teams. And we're referring to them as CHAT. It's a little bit of rebranding. But these teams will respond on low acuity calls. Currently, Portland Fire and Rescue responds on around 26,000 low acuity calls per year. That's a 3-year average. So that equates to about 71 per day. The objective of these CHAT teams is to provide care in the community. We want to improve health literacy by taking the time to connect community members to primary care physicians, insurance providers, medication, and provide basic medical services to reduce unnecessary transports, emergency department visits, and cost to the system. We presented this concept to Care Oregon. They are highly interested in the concept and have agreed in principle to provide upfront funding for personnel and logistics during a proof of concept phase. Following the phase, the proof of concept phase, they've agreed to provide ongoing funding on the various options there. And we anticipate having a contract agreement to present to City Council the first week in October. In addition, we are currently scheduling one-on-ones with each of the commissioners for the coming weeks to provide full briefings on this. So it's exciting news for us, and I think it's going to be a game changer for Portland Fire.
Thank you, Tim and Lisa and Chief Boone. And I wanted to highlight here, in this section about alternative emergency service models, we need innovative thoughts around, breaking away from traditional work settings in service models. So what you're hearing is unique options. Mayor? There you go.
There we go. Could I get do you have an executive summary or a draft on that proposal that I could take a look at?
Yes, Mayor.
Could you possibly email that to me today? If not right now, I'd actually like to take a look at it.
Yeah, Mayor, is that a yes, Tim? You'll be able to put together an executive summary to the mayor. So,
thank you.
As we go forward, we're 5 months into this work plan for community safety. My intent is to continue to work with the directors and the chiefs of the community safety bureaus to come up with innovative ideas on how we can do our business differently, and then bring them back to you and present them as we get them. So this is another one that Chief Boone has been working on for quite some time, actually. And Chief, thank you for bringing your staff to the table today. We always appreciate hearing from you. The last item, if we want to go to the next slide, is governance. And I'll only take 2 seconds on this. I have talked for a long time.
Excuse me,
Oh,
Director Myers.
Yes,
did we skip Portland Street Response, or did I miss it?
We were not going to have a conversation here about Portland Street Response because we covered it on Tuesday. But it is another innovative system that you and Chief Boone have brought out and put into the forefront. But we did not have a speaking item on that. But that is another example, Commissioner, of an innovative type of service model that's different and unique.
Yes, and of course, when we're talking about reducing 911 calls, we have to take into account who we're going to send, who's going to be responding to those calls, and yeah. So I just thought we missed it.
Yeah, no, it is an important topic, but we did not have it on the speaking list today. But your intention is correct. That as we lower call volume, we reallocate that to some other location. I always use the example and someone that's playing softball at a ball field and rounds second base and fractures their ankle. They're not in need of an ambulance and a fire truck. They need an ambulance. And same goes with people that are in mental health crisis. They don't need a police officer. We need someone that can actually work with individuals in the field around behavioral and mental health. Lisa.
I wanted to include the executive summary and proposal we're sending to the mayor is inclusive of all the community health programs that we're discussing, and it's the full picture.
Thank you, Lisa. We appreciate your help. So the last item is governance, and the governance is really the administrative duties that all of the bureaus independently take on: a payroll, time carding, accounting, data, communications, and the budget process within their bureaus. I want to let the team know today, I've been working closely with Chief Lavelle and his CFO, which is Ken Lee, and the chief has agreed to allow the budget for the police bureau, along with their finance operations, to come up and out of police and rest under the community safety division. That'll give the chief the support I think he needs to help us work on the bigger budget. That is a huge budget. And at the same time, Interim Director Papa FMU has done the same thing. We started working on that project together when I was with her as the emergency manager. And then Chief Boone is, we are bringing her finance team up, and we're going to keep some budget options in the Fire Bureau for at least another year. But we're going to really work on that finance part at that higher level, where we can start working across the board on efficiencies in accounting, payroll, and time carding, and return those services back to those bureaus, we think we have room for a lot of improvement there. And then Bob, Chief Director Causey, will leave his organization alone for a little bit while he has a different governance model. And so that's kind of where governance is at. I'd be willing to talk about that later when we have a little bit more time. Next slide, please. So real quick, the intent also is to start building a dashboard that's live for you, where you can really look at all of the work that we're doing. I come from a system when I was working in Las Vegas where performance-based management was the leading factor, the way we did business, and everything was posted live, whether it was how many fires we were keeping to the room of origin, what our cardiac arrest survivability rate was, or what clearance weights were on certain things that we were doing out in the field. And you could see that live. And I think we need that at the community safety level. So we will be building that dashboard for you, so you're well aware of the things that we are doing in community safety. Next slide. Team, we had sent out an invite to some community members. We asked council to please give us a couple of names of individuals that you might ask to kind of witness what we're trying to do here. And we were able to give a presentation to not all of them, but some of them last week. We've invited them here today, and many of them are present. It's hard to look through the chat and find them all, so I'm going to ask if all of the participants that are guests would raise their hand feature, use your hand feature and just raise your hand right now. I'm going to go down my list and ask you to introduce yourself. The first one I have on my list is Lakiana Drury. Can you unmute, Lakiana, and introduce yourself?
Yeah, Lakiana Drury, he, him, his pronouns, Executive Director of Word Response, a nonprofit that works to rewrite the narrative between young Black men in law enforcement. I'm also a member of the Portland Committee on Community Engaged Policing.
Lakiana, thank you for being here today. Alana?
Yes, Ilana J. Wilson, and I'm the Executive Director of Next Up. I am also on the steering committee for the Reimagine Oregon project, as well as the Reimagining Public Safety. So glad to be here with you all.
Yeah, thank you for spending time with us today. Vadim?
Hello, everybody. Vadim Mazursky. At various times, I have worked with the Portland Commission on Disability, the Citizen Review Committee that, as you know, hears complaints against the Police Bureau, as well as the Portland Committee on Community Engaged Policing. I'm also the president of the Public Safety Action Coalition. Glad to be here and glad to work alongside Lakiana and other people here in this room in the past.
Thank you. Did I miss anybody? I didn't see any other hand raised, but I want to make sure I didn't miss anybody. Gina, were you joining us as a community member?
Yes, I am.
Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, my name is Gina Ronning, and I am the program director for the Insight Development Group. It's a community-based restorative justice education program serving the population over at the Oregon State Correctional Institution. I also currently sit on the Training Advisory Council for PPB, and I'm also currently a new community member for the Focus Intervention Team Community Oversight Group.
Thank you. Anybody else did I miss? Just go ahead and unmute and introduce yourself. Okay. This is the opportunity, community members, and thank you for being here to kind of weigh in on what you just heard. I know there was a lot, and we also have, many of you, you've probably heard me talk about the work plan in different settings. So if you want to raise your hand, again, I will call on you and you can make comment, ask hard questions, give your thoughts on the work plan, and help us build direction. Vadim, I see your hands up.
Oh, thank you. I want to thank everyone for working on these important matters that will help shape the future of Portland. I want to particularly thank Nike Green and the bedrock work that the Office of Violence Prevention is doing to save lives by preventing gun violence. As I'm sure you'll agree, community safety, including the prevention of gun violence, is one of the fundamental factors of our government. I'm sure we all agree that the current rate of shootings and murders is amongst the highest in Portland history. City Council has declared that the current level of gun violence to be a public health crisis, and even talked about declaring it as a state of emergency. Certainly this emergency is reflected in the testimony today provided by Bob Causey with respect to 911 calls having increased 20 to 45%. Yet the response today, which I don't disagree with as a whole, certainly does not sound like it's an emergency response. It seems that the response is to reduce 911 calls by investing in additional sidewalks, tree canopies, and healthy food. Hiring a consultant to make sure that the right responders are answering the right calls, and using alternative service models like the Portland Street Response, even though currently PSR is staffing only one van in the Lentz neighborhood, and changing the governance structure for emergency services such as PPB, Fire Bureau, and BOAC. So while I agree that investments in historically underserved communities would benefit all of Portland, and all the other tasks that are discussed today are important in the future of Portland, none of these responses seem to be an emergency response to the crisis we're currently facing. So I would urge City Council and everyone in this room in the fall BMP, in the fall bump, and in next year's budget to add resources that will provide an instant impact to the current high level of shootings in Portland. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vadim. Lakiana.
Where's my mute button? I was just gonna list off just a couple of just my own thoughts and maybe ask a question since you did invite that. I 100% agree. Call volumes need to be addressed. Some of the things that come to mind with that, first and foremost, the Portland Street Response and really investing in that. I think it was a huge missed opportunity not to increase the funding when that vote was up this past summer. And I would, at the end, I would love to just hear what the plan is to invest in that, because I think that that's an incredible opportunity to decrease those calls. You know, we're setting the police bureau up for failure to the amount of calls that they're taking and the amount of different work that they're being asked to serve is just setting them up for failure because it's not in the scope of their work, especially when we look at mental health calls and things of that nature. So I think it's paramount to do that. But I think in the interim, until those other avenues can be developed, the Bureau needs to do its best job to train officers or whatever it needs to do. Like we had the incident at Motel 6 a couple of months ago. And I think that's a perfect example of where a Portland Street Response or just different training is really critical. I think we also need to understand just that 911 and calling 911 falls heavily on race lines, and a lot of people of color do not use 911. It's primarily used by white people, and a lot of times it's even used by white people to call on Black people or other people of color for doing everyday work. So I think that there is a trust issue, and most of, I work a lot with youth populations and things of that nature. They're not calling 911. They don't have that faith in those institutions, and all of these pieces are certain. They go hand in hand. My trust in the police will directly affect my ability to want to call them, and things of that nature. And then what am I calling them for? And if there's other lines, and being more specific around that, I think it's going to be really big. So I think that's a piece to think about. I think also just making some services free. I think if we made TriMet free, that would also could indirectly impact call volumes and allow people to navigate the city without the burden of having to pay. And then again, that falls on a race and an economic line. So those are just some of the pieces that I'm looking at. Houseless is also a huge issue, and being careful not to criminalize that. And so I think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done. I would agree with Vadim with a sense of urgency. And I think fundamentally, when we talk about gun violence, we have to help educate or create a true education for students, especially students of color. There's far too many of them that attend schools where they don't feel welcome. They don't see teachers that look like them. And so if I was to say one thing that would directly impact gun violence in particular, it would be a massive investment into education. and not just in like, like mathematics and things of that nature, but helping students feel like they are worthy of achieving something in this world, and it will return tenfold. It'll be much cheaper to invest on that end than to provide emergency services on the back end. So those are some of the things that are important to me in this conversation.
Thank you, Lakiana. And you and I have talked many, many times, and we talk about these issues, and I appreciate you keep these on point. Gina?
Thank you. First of all, thank you for all of your very insightful information and plans moving forward for a more comprehensive community safety plan. I really do appreciate the project ShapeUp. I think that looking at urban development and sense of place and how environments shape communities is extremely important. And I think that that's something that Portland really should be investing in and looking at. So I really appreciate that plan. I went ahead and posted in the chat box some key areas that are important to me as someone, both as an advocate for restorative justice and also someone who really appreciates a more holistic public health model to public safety. And for me, there are several pillars, and I put them in there. One is sense of place, which again goes back to that environmental piece, which I think you're addressing in your urban development plan. But the other piece that I feel is lacking, and it continues to lack in a lot of conversations, not just around gun violence, but just violence in communities in general, whether it's domestic violence, youth violence, and gun violence broadly defined, right, to include all various types of forms, is what we're going to call social relational health. And this has to do with the way people view their relationship to each other in community. While it is, of course, true that systemic racism, history of institutional oppression has a huge role in things like poverty, access, and violence, what also does not seem to get talked about, though, is, quite frankly, issues pertaining to conflict resolution rooted in violence, that youth and a lot of folks who lean heavily on violence as a way of solving problems. The truth is, as someone who has worked with offenders, whether they've been affiliated members in gangs or other individuals who have had long history of violent crime, I can tell you that for many of these people, they actually didn't live in poverty. Crime was a very lucrative pathway for them. So it wasn't really a lack of resources. And in my 10 plus some odd years of working with violent offenders, one of the things that I have learned and discovered is that violence is a preferred way of managing conflict. And until we provide resources and alternatives to help individuals manage conflict differently, we're always going to have this be a problem very present and alive. And so I really hope that Portland does fall of having to say this resource over this other resource, right? So I'm not here advocating to not do any of those resources that you all presented. I like them all. What I'm asking you to do instead is to also integrate a component that includes restorative justice, community justice, and programs specifically targeting and geared towards helping communities engage in nonviolent conflict resolution processes, helping youth and adults engage with conflict in their communities differently, particularly young men, who is the primary, not the sole, but the primary demographic that we see, young men and also middle-aged men that are engaging in violent behavior. And one of the solutions for that is restorative justice and community-based justice programming. Interventions and interruptions are also really helpful. So I'm just kind of adding that in there. And then I also just obviously want to highlight that community health is also a really key piece, along with interruption, which is integrating police, obviously. For me, I think that reimagining justice is also reimagining the role of police. It's not to get rid of policing per se, but it is to change the way policing is done and to really invest in community-based policing models and empowering communities to decide how they want to interact with the police, particularly communities that don't engage with police and don't want to engage with police, to find meaningful pathways to empower those communities to have an actual say over what that looks like. Thank you for your time.
Gina, thank you. Alana, thank you. Lakiana, Vidam, thank you for being with us today and helping us navigate through this. And I appreciate your comments and thoughts. And we'll make sure we stay in touch as we move forward and have these bigger, broader conversations. Let's put the slide set back up. We have just a little bit more to go. We want to give space for council to have some dialogue. Tom, we've covered the 4 action areas. We've heard from the community today. I wanted to turn it back over to you to kind of get the ball rolling with some discussion with council and get some confirmation on the direction we're headed or receive some new direction. And I want to thank council for having me here today and appreciate you all hosting this.
Thanks, Mike. So council, at the beginning, I gave you a little foreshadowing of questions that we were going to get to, and now here we are. So after that very interesting set of presentations and feedback from our community panel, we could and should take more time for all of these questions, and we will, but want to get initial feedback from council around does this work plan as it's shaping up meet your expectations? We attempted to give you samples of each of parts of the work plan. It was not meant to be comprehensive. So Commissioner Hardesty, to your question around street response, we took an innovative example from fire and rescue that is in the works as indicative of what's going on in alternate response models. We could have taken examples in lots of other areas. We're just trying to give you a taste of the direction of the work plan to see if this is meeting your expectations for this new division. I see that Commissioner Mapps has his hand up.
Thanks, Tom. And I want to thank Mike Myers for pulling together this presentation. And I want to thank everyone who presented today. I'm really impressed by the work that has been done, and I support all of it. But I think the question before us is, does this work plan meet my expectations? And I'll be honest with you, not entirely. Something which is absent from this presentation and this work plan are outcomes and goals. I have many goals across the public safety spectrum. We didn't really talk very much about Portland street response or policing today, so I'll leave those comments aside. Just focusing in on the topics we talked about today, I'd like to see some specific goals around reducing gun violence. My personal goal and challenge to my colleagues on council and to the city is to reduce gun violence by 20% in the next 15 months. I'm agnostic in terms of how we get there. Obviously, we have to be true to our values and respect the constitutions, people's individual rights and people's individualism. But I desperately feel, based on the feedback I get every day from my constituents, that we have to bring gun violence down. Effort and good intentions are not enough. We have to set a goal and hold ourselves accountable for meeting that goal. So that is one place where I'd like to see some more clarity. And Director Myers, if we can get, or Coordinator Myers, if you could help us get there in future or iterations of that, that would be quite helpful. I also, and this is a request to Mr. Myers, I think to help me reach another outcome. As you all know, I'm the commissioner in charge of the Bureau of Emergency Communications. We fundamentally need to migrate 500,000 non-emergency calls from BOIC to 311. We had some dialogue around that. I think the feedback I'm getting from our folks over at BOIC is this is something we need to accomplish within, basically also within the next 15 months. At the same time, from the dialogue I heard today, there's maybe a plan for migrating 60,000 calls from non-emergency over to 311. That gap between 60,000 and 500,000, I need to hear, we need a plan for how we close that gap. And it is absolutely, I know every bureau takes advantage of 311 because they provide a fundamental service. I'll remind you that our folks who are trying to reach us over at 911 are literally in life and death situations. These are people having heart attacks, people who have been shot, people who have been in car crashes, and we have them waiting online up to 5 minutes. This is unacceptable. I take blame for this. I'm the commissioner in charge of the Bureau of Emergency Communications, but as a team and as a city, I need your help in helping us get from where we are to where we need to be.
So, Commissioner, let me weigh in because I know you have a couple more comments. Let me say this because I think this is important before you take blame for anything. Look, this didn't build to this situation overnight. And part of what I'm trying to do is establish a base where we are constantly watching these things and managing workload and managing call volume. The reason that we're all here in this emergency today, and we're talking about the police being overwhelmed with call volume, gun violence off the hook, call wait times, is because we have not been managing it to this point. And so my goal, I will do everything I can to right size the ship in 15 months. Matt, I know that it's going to be an extremely heavy lift, but we will get it done. After that, it is about sustaining constant, focused attention and managing it. That's the key. Now, you also know I only have so much authority here. I have the responsibility over getting OVP dollars out. CBO dollars out for reduction in gun violence. I have some bringing in Dr. J to help me look at, those kind of things, but I don't supervise these chiefs and these directors. So I need commitments from this staff. If you're going to ask me to be responsible for these performance measures and I accept the challenge, I'm either going to have the authority to get it done, or I need your commitment to make sure that your directors and your chiefs are right there with me to do this work. This means that I should not be the one asking that we need to aggressively review call volume today. Your directors and your chiefs should have been doing that all along. So it's okay that we're where we're at. We just need to do this together, right? Together, and I'm willing to take on the work and get it done. So that's kind of where I want to make sure that we have a clear understanding with each other. I will get the work done. I need the direction from you on what you want, and they need the help with the authority to get it done.
Thank you, Mr. Myers. I want to assure you that our team is in 100%. I see my colleagues have their hands up too. So let me just quickly address Tom's second question. How do I want to be informed of your progress moving forward? I believe it was proposed that we have a dashboard. I'm a big fan of dashboards. I'd like to see them updated as often as possible. So I applaud that and thank you for that innovative move. And I will be quiet for a bit so my other colleagues can weigh in.
Great. Commissioner Hardesty.
This work session exceeded my expectations. I knew a lot of hard work went into it, and I am very grateful that we're having this helicopter view presentation today. When I first came, I had all the first responder bureaus in my portfolio with the exception of police. And so it's very easy for me to understand the interconnectedness of these bureaus. And in 2 years, I learned just how interdependent these bureaus are. In answer to the question that you put on the table, the first question was, does this work plan meet my needs? And the answer is, I don't know yet, because I've only seen the slides that you presented to me. But I want to be clear. I definitely want to and will be involved in how this plan develops and how the measurable outcomes are developed.
Good.
I think that there are really big questions that we must answer before we just throw money at problems. The first question is staffing levels for police. I don't believe that police can only take 3 calls a night and they tell everybody else that their budget was cut and they can't respond. And so we need real information about really how do Portland police officers spend their day. I'm not over the $152,000 that was spent for police officers to sit around all day and eat while East Portland was being terrorized. And so we have to do it all, but we have to do it thoughtful. I will not buy off into any timeline about any percentage because everything that we talked about today and on Tuesday is related to community safety.
Right.
And if there was a one-size-fit-all easy solution, we'd have done it a long time ago.
Right.
There isn't. And so for me today, I'm not quite sure if the presentation presented by the Office of Violence Prevention is what they will do with the new investment of dollars or what they're doing today. So that was not clear to me. I heard a lot, but what I didn't hear is kind of what's the roll up with the new dollars and how that's going to have an impact on the violence that we're seeing every day. We keep talking gun violence without talking about the categories of gun violence and really the incidents that lead to gun violence. Bob Cossey can tell us that domestic violence has been up from 25 to 145% every week since the pandemic began. And I don't see how we are incorporating that kind of community safety effort into this work plan. There's also big things that are outside of Director Myers' preview. It is the Reimagine Police Oversight Board. It is the Charter Review Commission. It is the Truth and Reconciliation process that we're going to be starting the RFP and sending that out. How do all these other efforts fit into this work plan if we are truly creating a integrated community safety system? And so for me, those are the questions that came up for me today. I do need to see more, and I also need to be involved in the decision-making process. I saw an organizational chart that did not include any of the people of color who are leading these bureaus, and I was very concerned about that. So I just want to make sure that the commissioners, the electeds that are in charge of the bureaus, are really key players. I don't want to see Mike Myers and Tom Reinhardt go off behind closed doors and develop a plan. Thank you.
You have our commitment on that, Commissioner. We hear you loud and clear. Thanks for your comments. Commissioner Rubio.
Thank you, Tom. I also just want to say to you, Mike, thank you for all your work on this. And I was really happy with the presentation. I feel like we're on the right track. But I really want to just applaud you for your frankness and your directness with us today about just what you need from us to be successful. I mean, this is all a function of our leadership and our ability to making sure that we're collaborating with you, that we're directing our leadership to participate with you. And so it's going to go as fast and as successful as we are taking leadership with our own bureaus to support this work. So I, for one, am very committed. I don't have a large public safety bureau, but we do have a role, in our, as a parks commissioner. But also I feel like BPS also brings to bear some work in this as well. So you have my full commitment to be participatory. And quite frankly, I would love to be more involved than I have. And I think it's not a secret that I've been asking to be involved, and I would love to take a more substantial and supportive role in helping you move this along. So in any way that we can be of assistance, we're there. I think that everyone has expressed at one time or another in my private conversations or check-ins or one-on-one or even in our everyday work, we all have a strong interest and concern about the gun violence that's happening right now in the community. We are all there, and we're all ready to tackle this issue. So we stand ready to have a more focused conversation when that time comes. Just know that we're there as well. Just some feedback. I love the idea of consolidating all the business functions. I think that's an excellent idea, and it's good for the city. It's good for the community. And then we have the big look, across the city about where our priorities and how we're actually making funding and staffing and business decisions with transparency. I think that's great. I also love the dashboard. As a recovering nonprofit person, we survived on dashboards for our board and our staff as well, and our funders. So I love that idea. I would just like to offer that it would be great to have some timelines so that we can sort of track the progress of the dashboard, and also places where we need to show up more, on those in those places. But overall, just please keep going with the frankness. I think we need to hear it, and that's quite frankly something that makes it crystal clear where our role is expected to perform. So thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner. Commissioner Ryan.
Yes, thank you. I realize the time is ticking. I'll try to be really to the point. First of all, thank you. It was amazing. I thought everyone was very direct and clear. Your leadership, Mike Myers, was really felt both earlier in the week, the other session, and today, and it's a value added for the whole community, the whole city. I just think when it comes to 911, 311, there's too many numbers. No one can keep up with that. I mean, no one knows anyone's numbers anymore anyway. They just press someone's contact. So imagine trying to educate a community on 4 different numbers. So I could maybe live with 2 numbers, 911 and 311, but we have to streamline that. So that's one blunt little comment I'd like to give you. The second is, I think, of course, we all love dashboards. We're elected officials, but the community deserves a dashboard. The community needs to know what we are monitoring, and they need that kind of accountability. To me, it's less about what's our goal in 18 months. It's like, where are we today? And then in 1 month's time, did we move one direction or the other? That's called accountability. That's called tracking the dashboard 1 month at a time. And so I look forward. I know Micah was up for a brief moment. I didn't even take a photo of it. It'll be fun to explore that with you, and I'm sure all the office as well. I'll also just end with, I think the work plan is evolving. I think this is the second of the third meeting, work session. So my expectation on the work plan is on November 2nd, we'd land that plane, that we'd come to the November 2nd work session with more clarity about the work plan. And between today and then, our offices can all be involved with all of you. And so that would be my expectation for the work session, the third work session. Thank you to all the guests. And I want to end with Director Kazi. There's been a lot of information about the long wait times. I really want to say thank you for your report, because it woke me up to the fact of how much they've increased, and the press hasn't mentioned that. So I'm grateful that you had that honest assessment of what we're actually dealing with today in terms of the high volume of calls. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mayor Wheeler. I think you're still on mute, Mayor. I'm taking Commissioner Hardesty's role and telling you you're on mute.
Won't be happy about that. Don't do that. I want to build on what Commissioner Ryan just said, which everybody mentioned as a threat. First of all, let's not be too hard on ourselves. We've actually come a long way on a whole host of issues in a very short period of time. And as a council, we're unified in a way that very few city councils nationally ever are on these issues. We're doing it because we have a unique form of government. We do not have a public safety bureau, a unified public safety bureau under a commissioner. What we have is a council form of leadership. And so as I looked at the work plan here, obviously I support all of it. There are significant parts of it here that we still have a lot of work to do. I'm enjoying working with Commissioner Hardesty and talking about how we can do a broader rollout of street response. There's still some logistical issues we have to iron out, but we will. I am very enthusiastically continuing to provide support for 311. I've long championed that. I'm going to continue to champion that. And Director Kazi, I'm frankly surprised more people have not left BOIC, and more of our call dispatchers have not burned out. And I am deeply concerned about that. And I'm keenly aware of what they're going through. And we absolutely need to move with urgency on this, not just for the sake of the community and public safety, but for the sake of our employees. We're burning them out and we're losing really good employees, and they will be hard to replace. That's why I asked the question that I did. Is my suspicion is these folks don't just come off the shelf. My suspicion is you're looking for some unicorns, and then you have to train the unicorns. And we're competing in a very, very competitive job market for a lot of the same skill sets that everybody else is looking to. With regard to the public safety piece, what makes this difficult for you, Director Myers, and the reason we hired you was to bring coordination and where we can build consensus and where we can't provide leadership on a functional, coordinated, rationalized public safety system that does in fact achieve the goals that we state from the public that we intend to achieve. I think we should spend a little more time on how we are going to facilitate differences of opinion on key issues like police staffing. We cannot afford to be conflict avoidant when we're talking about whether we're going to increase the police bureau personnel or not, and in what capacity, for what purposes, to do what, right? And so I think that's, we all know each other enough. You're direct enough. I think we're all direct enough that we can stomach those conversations and still get along just fine. And so I would really encourage you to push us on key decision points that might otherwise become sticking points. I do want to build on communications a little bit. I do think the public is confused about what we're doing, what we are working towards, what North Star we are aiming towards, what our objectives are, and where we're succeeding, and being honest about where we're not succeeding and what challenges we're experiencing, and how long it's going to take us to do the things we say we are going to do. I think we need to be really transparent about that. And I realize governments are not good at establishing goals, specific goals. I think this council is an exception. I think we are. I think we're really good at it. And this is an area where we should absolutely be putting some markers out there in terms of what we're going to accomplish, so the public has some sense that we're engaged, that we're working together, even if we have differences of opinion on some issues, that we are bringing our bureaus to bear in a way that they're all rowing in the same direction. And then we need to talk about the results we're getting from the community. And I hate to say it, but we have our job, the media has their job. I think we're good at what we do. I think the media is good at what they do, but those things are not necessarily in alignment, and we should never assume that they are. The information that we as elected leaders believe that the public needs to hear, the burden is on us, not on the press, to get that information out to the public. So that means we have to create the templates, we have to create the dashboards, we have to find the means of communication for those people in our community who have an interest in this. I want to thank our presenters today. I thought these were excellent presentations. And to our citizen participants, I want to thank you not only for being here today, but I know a lot of you give a lot of your time, your talent, your energy in other capacities for the city of Portland, and I want to acknowledge and thank you for that too. You guys help us, you're part of our team, and you make us better, even when you don't agree with us. You're an important part of our team, and we appreciate your being here today. And thank you, last but not least, Director Myers and CAO Tom Reinhardt. I think we're off to a great start here, I really do.
Great, thanks to council and the whole commission. I want to make just give me a couple seconds to close on next steps. I know we're at 4:01. Apologies for that. So when we cracked up the ice 2 years ago, and we didn't know where the ice flows would drift or how we would bring it back together, but we broke open this conversation. We're in a much different spot. There is a lot of urgency, and thank you for the community panel for emphasizing that. We will come back to you with follow-ups individually and as a collective. We will raise the points around there's a tension between the upstream investments that Dr. J is working with us on and the immediate crises that we're facing. And we need to work through that with everybody on where we're going to invest and spend time. Bob did a very good job showing how a 911, 311 is at the nexus in terms of a lot of this. So we're starting to think as a system, we will bring you hard choices. We will bring you opportunity cost questions. And we will be direct, and thank you for the encouragement to Mike and Mike's new team. I propose that we do the rounds with all of you so that we're prepared in November with a dashboard and performance measures and a more fleshed out work plan. And I think that was my learning today, is that we got some work to do to finalize and land that with you. And thanks for the push on that. Did I miss anything, council? Do you agree that we should just do the team meeting with everybody to prepare for November? Okay, great. Excellent session today. Thank you. And I know it's tiring, particularly virtually. Thanks for your leadership and your patience.
Thank you, everybody. We're adjourned.